Hey everyone, welcome to this week's video. This is actually the first video of this year. I do apologise for that, but if you want to know a bit more about that, hang on to the end of the video and I'll explain a little bit. However, this video is going to be about level streaming. Level streaming is great. It's where you can have multiple worlds within one larger world, but then load them in as and when they're necessary. So for example, entering a building. So there's a quick example here, which I've knocked up. So you load into sort of the default top-down map. I want to go inside this little building here, but from a top-down perspective that doesn't really work. So we'll go to enter the building. It runs us in, little transition there, and then we load into a separate level, a separate world, but it's all housed within sort of a greater world. And then when you want ready to leave, you can just transition back out. And I'll just explain quickly here what's going on in the back end. So you can see here we've got like a whole world which we can just switch off, so there's no world existing. And then at any point we want to load in the rest of that building, we can load it in and unload the world, and we're left with just that building. And that's what we're going to go through today. So stick around and let's just jump straight into it. Okay, so I've just loaded up a brand new top-down template, and what I've also done is I've just opened up the levels window. Now you can do that by going to window and selecting levels at the top. Now there is a chance that you have world partitioner open by default. You can close this. Level streaming and world partitioning are slightly different. Just a quick differentiate the two. World partitioner is probably better suited to really large open maps, stuff like GTA and stuff like that. Whereas level streaming is probably better to be used in small to medium. Now that's not to say that either of them can't be used for the other maps, so you can use world partitioning in a small map. It's just you'll probably find there's a lot more work involved for what it's worth. Whereas levels, it can be set up quite quickly, but as your world gets really large, it can get a bit more complicated. So that's probably where the two have been made for. Levels, I'd start with levels. As your game grows, I'd probably consider switching to world partitioning. But if you know your world's going to be massive, just go straight for partitioning. And if that's the case, this video is not for you. So we've got levels open, and we're going to make just a simple transition. So to explain this best, we're gonna take all of these assets and we're gonna make a world with it. Now you can see here that levels or level streaming is disabled when world partitioning is enabled. Now that's because the default world that you get spawned into or is opened in the editor has partitioning enabled. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a different level without it, and but we're going to take all these assets with us. So we're going to press Ctrl and A, and we're going to just copy everything on the map, and then we're going to go File, New Level. And you can see here we've got Open World or Basic. Now Open World will have partitioning enabled by default, so this is not what you want. Whereas the basic levels don't have it, so then streaming will be enabled, or you'll be able to use streaming. So we're going to select Empty Level, which is a basic level. I'm going to hit Create, and as you can see the level window is already updated with all this information. This is now what's considered a persistent level, which is almost like the parent level, and we can add children to it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go File, Save As, go to Top Down and Maps, and I'm just going to save this one as Persistent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new level, but underneath the levels. So go to Level, Create New, and we're going to create a new empty level. And we're going to call this one World. And then within World, make sure that you've got it double clicked, and it should say Level World here. And then we'll just paste in. And if you've done everything right so far, you should have pasted in the top-down template that we had just a moment ago. And if you click this little toggle level visibility button here and click that, everything should disappear, and then the world should come back. Now, if you was just to press play right away, you probably just fall through the air. But you can't see that, but you are falling through the air. Because this world has been set up automatically to be enabled by blueprints. So to change that, we can right click and we can change the streaming method to always loaded. What this does is when you press play, it will always be there. Now, you can turn it off using blueprints, that's absolutely fine. It's just as your sort of first area to run around in, it's probably best to have it always loaded. Now, you might be asking, why didn't we put it in the persistent level? Now, this is possibly personal preference, but I typically, well, it is personal preference. I typically like to have an empty persistent level. So that's completely blank. It doesn't affect anything whatsoever. On some games, I'd possibly put in the lighting, so the lighting's consistent throughout the entire game. But when you're going sort of like in buildings and outside buildings, you might not want to do that. So what you could do is, let's close out that for example. With the world selected, you could select all of your lighting here, press Control and X, which will remove it, and then go to your persistent world by double clicking and just pasting it back in. So now if you turn your persistent world off, your game world's still there, but there's no lighting. But vice versa, if you turn your world off, your lighting's consistent. So if we just create a new world now, let's create a new empty. Let's call this Zone 1. Zone 1. And let's say we get rid of the world and we just have Zone 1. The lighting's going to be the same no matter what we load in and what we don't. So that's a useful thing for me, because we've got the lighting now on the persistent. So now we're in Zone 1. What we're going to do is we're just going to select the floor from World 1 and we're just going to copy and paste. So now we've got a floor in Zone 1 if we hide the world. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this all the way to the right, get the world in, and we'll just overlap it just a little bit. Just like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this wall for the time being. With inside the world, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the Nav Mesh Bounds. I'm going to drag that over to this side. And essentially what that does is... Actually, sorry, I've made a mistake there. We don't want to do that. We want to copy the Nav Mesh Bounds, go to the Zone 1 and then paste. And then what we'll do is we'll drag that over. The reason we're going to do that is because you'll see that the entire area is now covered by a Nav Mesh. But if we remove World 1, our zone is still going to be accessible. So we can move that over. And you can see our Zone 1 is still going to be accessible using Nav Mesh. So, let's press play. And let's go over here. And you'll notice, whoa, Zone 1's not there. And that's because we've not told it to load Zone 1 just yet. So let's do that. Now, what I'm going to do, just to help me out a little bit here, explain things, I think the camera's just a little bit too zoomed in, and it doesn't really help. So I'm just going to increase the spring arm length to 1750, and hopefully that's a bit more zoomed out, and it'll give you a bit more to look at as we're running around. So we go over here, and you can see that as soon as I get over here, the Nav Mesh doesn't like the fact that there's nothing there. Okay, so here we are. What we can do inside the world, so double click world, make sure that you are in world. We're going to create a volume and we're going to create a trigger volume. Now that looks like it's close to the screen, but it isn't, so I'm just going to drag that over, drag that down there. I'm going to press the end key and drop it down to ground level. If you press the end key, what it'll do is it'll drop whatever you've got selected until it hits any surface, which is very useful. We're going to find where our world ends, which is on this line, so that's fine. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and get this cube, this trigger volume, to sort of fill this whole area. Something like that. So there's no way I can run past there without going through the trigger volume. Now, you wouldn't necessarily do this because you wouldn't want this to... this is going to look quite abrupt. When we hit this trigger volume and we tell the zone 1 to load in, it's just going to go... and it's just going to be there. You're probably going to want to hide this with like a building or a doorway or a transition, but we'll get to that. This is just an example for visual purposes, I guess. So now with World 1 selected and the trigger volume selected, so you just select your trigger volume, we're going to open up the level blueprint. So you can access that using this little widget here. And that's a pretty neat feature actually about levels, is that you can go into the blueprint of any level that you've got within your hierarchy. So let's go into World 1. And what we want to do is we want to create an action when somebody walks in to that trigger volume. So to do that, we're going to right click, and because you've selected it, in the level blueprint, it gives you the option to use that trigger volume. So we're going to add an event. It's going to be based on collision, and it's when an actor overlaps it. So let's just get rid of those two for now and just focus on this. Now, the actor that I'm concerned about hitting it is myself. So what I want to do is cast to top-down character. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because if this cast fails, I know it's not my character. If it succeeds, it is. Now, in a multiplayer game, you wouldn't use this. I don't know what you'd use. You might cast a character and check to see. I'm not too sure. This is just a good way to make sure it's only you, the player, going into it. Yeah, pretty much. I guess on a multiplayer game, you may want multiple people to be able to go through it, so you might be able to cast to character or something like that. Anyway, so once this is triggered, we want to check to see if the other actor is our player. We can connect these two. If that's the case, what we want to do is we want to load in a streamed level. So load stream. Now you can either do it by name, which we know zone 1, or by object reference. And the good thing about object reference is it gives you a drop down of every level that you've got, so you can just pick it. And then you've got the option of making it visible after load or not. Now I typically always do, it just makes it a bit easier. And let's see if that works. So let's compile, let's play. So we'll run over here, and then when we hit that trigger volume, our second area now loads. Now, because that nav mesh was there, or we copied that nav mesh over into the second area, it allows us to navigate this area now absolutely fine. Now, one thing I want us to be aware of when doing this is the nav meshes are actually static. So let's say something changes whilst you're playing, the nav mesh won't update to go around it. So the best way I can explain this really would be, what I'm going to do is if I go to zone 1, to get rid of my world for a second, I'm actually going to remove the nav mesh. If I go back to this world now, you'll see that my nav mesh ends here. I get rid of the zone, but I select my nav mesh and drag it over, I'll tell you what, over to there. When the zone's there, it loads the data, but when it's not, it doesn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press play now. Now, remember my nav mesh covered that area, but the floor wasn't there. So if I now in the level load it in, my sort of move to doesn't want to work because something's changed. When I press play on the game, that floor wasn't there, so it hasn't loaded that floor into its memory, so it doesn't actually know how to walk over there. Like, it doesn't exist to it. Now, granted, if you press and hold the mouse, you kind of force it to go in that direction, but that isn't right. If you're going to have dynamic things in your world and you need it to update live, there is something you can do. Now, if you scroll down in your outliner, you should find a recast nav mesh default. Now basically this is all the data of the area it's captured. So if you can see this green area, this is the Nav Mesh Bounds. This is what it can see as an area it can move in. And when you press play, this is the data that it works from, but it's not dynamic by default. If you go to the details up at the top and scroll down, now bear in mind you need to have the recast nav mesh selected for this. If you scroll down, you will find runtime eventually, and you can change the runtime generation from static to dynamic. Now what this does is every time something changes in your world, it allows the nav mesh to recalculate. This will have a hit on your performance. Now I've made some somewhat, I wouldn't say really big games, but some larger games, and I don't see a massive performance hit. But if you've got a lot of dynamic lighting and you're loading in quite a lot of sort of moving parts that are going to need this to update, I can't say for sure that you're not going to see a performance hit. You'll just have to try it and see. Now, if you read up online, there are ways you can work around this a little bit, but I don't find them to work well enough for me to use them. So I try to keep things as static as possible. Anyway, if we now press play and do the exact same thing, now bear in mind this is now dynamic. So if I run into this, it is now just dynamically updated, and we're good to go. So you can see there that really didn't make any performance visual, but this is a really small setup. So just work with that as you will. Now, what I'm probably going to say is it's probably just a good idea just to have a nav mesh in each zone, just so then that data's there. So when your character moves into them new areas, it's not expecting anything unusual, let's say. So let's continue. So now we've got this kind of this zone loading in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find where my camera is. So I'd say about, so when my camera is in between these two posts, this world, or this new zone isn't visible. So what I'm going to do is while I'm here, I'm going to trigger this new area to load. So then as I get a bit further down, I don't see blue sky in the background. Now, in the example, I used a building. So we went in and we transitioned. We'll get to that in just a minute, but what's probably best you're better off doing is if you're going to use this for like non-building areas, is try and find a way of sort of adding like a little path to your game where it separates the two large areas from each other. So quite a very simple path that you could just walk down. It's quite out in the open, let's say, or quite small, but it gives you a good opportunity to unload the big area that you've just left and then load in the new area. This is more evident in third-person games or first-person games where when you go through a doorway, or let's say if you've ever played like Warframe, you go through a portal, or you go through doors and then it leads to another door. You're kind of in like a separated chunk of map. So while you're in that, they can load the next area and unload the previous area. So you're only staying in each chunk, which is pretty neat. Anyway, enough talking. Let's get this trigger volume moved. So we'll move that to about there. So now, if I run over here, I don't even notice it. Like it just seems to be one consistent map. So I can do the same over on Zone 1, which I think I've actually put this. Oh no, I've selected an actor in World 1. That's fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this. This actor will be placed outside the bounds of the current level, so let's not do that. Let's just select the trigger volume and copy it, and then within Zone 1 we're going to paste. So this asset should now belong to Zone 1. Let's just double check that. That's true. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and find what position Oh, let's just copy that, and then again we'll paste that over here. What we're going to do is I'm just going to try and find an area at the other side where the rest of this map isn't visible. So we're not far off, probably here. So I'd say that's about there. Why not? So let's get rid of that. And this one, we'll select this trigger volume and we're going to go to the Zone 1 blueprint. Get rid of those. Right click, we're going to add an event, collision, on actor begin overlap. If this is cast to top down character, so if that's successful, I want to unload a stream. So at the bottom, unload stream level by object reference, select that. I want to unload my world, and that's pretty much it. So let's compile, let's save. So we'll run over here. So my new zone's loaded. We'll get over here a bit further, and I just quite saw it in the top corner, but the other world now has disappeared, and I don't think we put that nav mesh back in, did we? Because we've just deleted it. So let's just check that in zone 1. Do we have a nav mesh? We don't, but we do have a recast. However, that's not great. Let's go to world 1. Let's find the nav mesh. Copy that. Go to zone 1. Paste that in. And obviously it's absolutely massive now. We don't need that to be like that. So that covers that. That's fine. Let's find the other nav mesh, and we don't need that to be that big anymore, do we? So that'll be fine like that. Hit player. Run over. Become seamless. We run over here. We see our world disappears, and our nav mesh has persisted. So obviously we've just unloaded it, so when we run back it doesn't exist anymore. That's where doorways are pretty good, because then you can have that doorway stay shut, and we don't have to see all the sky around it. Yeah, so let's work on a transition. So I do apologise, I've not built out sort of like the building and stuff like that, but you can improvise. I just want to show you the basic bits. I've already recorded this video once, by the way, and with the building and everything that goes along with it, it ended up being like an hour, and I don't really want to keep you here for an hour. I'd rather just show you the elements that you need to use and give you some tips along the way where you can sort of build anything with it, rather than you can only build that doorway. So yeah, let's continue. So now what I want to do is I want to get this a little bit closer, but I want to create a transition, so the screen goes dark for a second as we load that new zone. That'll be useful for when you do doorways, because you can approach the door, load the room behind it, and then unload the world, and that only takes a couple of seconds. So it just looks like a going dark, like the example at the beginning where I show a clip of it now, where you run inside, it goes dark, and then when you're inside, the lighting of that building takes over instead. So let's move these. That was a good timing because of the saving, but let's move these trigger volumes. World 1 trigger volume. Let's move that a little bit closer. Now, if I remember rightly, zone 1's floor is just about there. So let's go for the first one. So it looks like we're going to be right on the edge now, and it transitions. Okay, that's fine. Except in zone 1, we don't want it to unload anymore. Or do we? Never mind. Let's just work on this transition to start. So, our trigger volume is hit, and then we're going to load this stream. Now, before we do, what we want to do is we want to go into darkness just for a second. Now, we can do this with every character in the game that has a camera manager. And what's good about that is you can get the player camera manager pretty much from any blueprint. So you can select that, and then the camera manager will return the basically it will return the manager. Sorry, but it's always responsible for the camera that the character's using. So what's good about that is there's some pre-built functions within that which allow you to fade, and appropriately named, it's called start fade. So you can start a camera fade, very useful. So we hit this trigger volume, we're going to start a fade. Now let me just talk through what these do. So from alpha to alpha is basically the opacity. How visible do we want it to be? So we want it to go from no opacity, so invisible, to completely solid, which would be 1. And then the colour is black, which it's already selected. And how long do we want this to take? So from 0 to 1, we can have it either instant, which won't look very nice, or we can have around about a second, which is okay. It's good enough. And what we want it to do is we want it to hold the hold when finished. That means after 1 second, it's going to remain black until we tell it to change back. So we'll tick that. Now, obviously, this fade is going to happen for a second, so we want to just delay anything else from happening for at least 1 second, just so we know the screen's definitely dark. And then at that point, we can load in our new area. So if we didn't add this delay, this would start to fade, but then instantly the world would load and the fade would be pointless. So we can hit play now, and we can run over to see our new area. We can click on here. You can see the world fades, and then I assume that it has loaded. So then what you can do is you can either there's 2 ways you can do this actually. You can either use the same node again to reverse this at the end, or when the zone 1 is loaded, it actually triggers the event begin play. So you could also get the player camera manager here and do a start fade. Now it sounds funny, there's a stop fade, but it literally just turns it off. So you actually want to start a new fade, but then do it in reverse. So from alpha 1 to 0, 1 second, and then hold when finished. Now I know that sounds daft that you're holding no fade. I don't know, my nose is really itchy. You can hold the fade, and then technically you could stop the fade just so then it's off. But you really want that transition to go through first. And that's going to be connected to that. So now we're going to run over, hit that, and then boom, that's really quick. So let's get rid of that. And that's because I didn't leave the 1 second. So delay 1 second, and then stop fade. Oh, and I didn't stop fade. There we go. Let's plug that in. And that's why you need to do the delay, because it allows the animation to happen. So we come over, and before you know it, the world is loaded, and we can speed that up a little bit. Sorry, slow that down a little bit, add a couple more seconds, just so it looks a little bit more. I'd say what we could do, we could have 1.5, and then 1.5 on here, like that, and then we need to change that. And this should look a little bit cleaner. That was a little bit quick. So fade. I don't know, maybe, who knows. So with all that being said, the other way you could have done it is instead of having it on the event begin play like that, you could then redo it after you've loaded with the fade again. So from this we can copy it and paste it here. then that way you're controlling it as much as you need to. There's only one downside to this, which I'll explain in just a minute. So you can have that fade. So it'll start fade, it'll load the level, and then it'll have this fade ease out, which would actually be the other way around, like that. The downside to this is if the level that you're currently in, if the world that's triggering it, so this is the world's blueprint, if when you load this level, if then the world gets unloaded, this blueprint can no longer run. So let's say we load the new area and then unload ourselves. So we'll load the new zone, that's fine, but as soon as we unload the world that we're currently in, nothing else can be triggered after that because the world isn't there to sort of execute it. That's kind of it. Anything after this node will not work. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So that's one of the benefits of using the event begin player, because when the zone loads in, it sort of takes over the camera fade. So what you could do is event begin player, something like this, and then unload the world behind it, like that. Now you may want to add a delay, sort of to prevent any complications. Let's say sometimes this can happen so quickly. If you don't have overlapping floors, you could fall through it. So that little delay just prevents that from happening. So now what you'll see is that this will actually never be triggered. Technically the screen should just stay black. So we'll do that. We run over and the screen will stay black because that code never gets, this blueprint here never gets a chance to be run. So that's where the get player camera and the start fade is beneficial here. So do that. Duration, we'll do 2 seconds and then hold. Compile. So what you'll see now is we'll come in, this will get loaded, and you can see that the other world now is gone. And it was all hidden with that transition, which is where this is where it's pretty neat, because if where this this border is, if you were to put, for example, actually let's just grab a random wall here. Let's grab that wall and let's say let's hold Alt and we'll drag this over to here like that. So what I'm doing is I'm just leaving a little bit of this green box on the outside of this wall, and you'll see why in just a minute. I'm going to pull that to there like that. So that should be enough for our camera to be able to click inside. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of these, copy, I'm going to go to zone 1, I'm going to paste, so they're in exactly the same place, except they won't exist, but then when we swap, they will, and it'll look seamless. So what we'll do is we'll play it, we're going to run over here, we're going to go in between these walls, it's going to fade out, we're going to transition, and then we're now in the new zone. Now, granted, for a top-down, I think it would look better if we shrink these down like that. These are all sort of like design ideas that you're gonna have to think about if you're doing a top-down, especially. So we'll come to there like that. That transition happens, and then we're in the new area, and then vice versa. You can run back, and we can set up a trigger volume. In the zone 1, so let's hide that. Let's set up this trigger volume, and essentially we're going to be copying what we've already done. It's the other way around, so we're going to Start a fade. Let's just copy all of these like that. So I'm just copying everything from the world back to the zone, paste. Let's just drag these down a little bit. What I'll do is I'll just zoom out a little bit there. That'll be bigger. So you just want to pause and then you can check that. But essentially you're doing your cast, starting your fade, but instead we're going to be loading the world and unloading zone 1. Hit compile, and then we're going to go back. So what we've done here, what have we done? I've just broken something somehow. So when we trigger that, that's fine. Okay, my world wasn't loaded. Let's play it. So let's run over here. We'll click on that. We're in the world. We run away. We go do our thing. We now want to get back into this zone, so we'll come here. So what's happened is the zone has unloaded and the world has... Ah, I know what's happened. So within the world, in the world, we don't actually tell the camera to stop the fade. So similarly to zone 1, we can copy that, go back to the world, paste that in. But we're going to delete the unload, and we'll drag that in like that, paste. Now you could see that flash just then. Now that's the only downside of this actually. Let's not do that. So the world having an event begin play camera fade isn't really a good idea. So in that case, when we come back, what we want to do is we want to start this fade and then unload the zone. So we'll copy that, paste it here. So from 1 to 0, 2 seconds, but we'll unload the zone immediately. So this transition will still happen, but hopefully we won't have visibility of this disappearing. Let's just try that out. Get over here, transition in. Come back, let's go on to there. Perfect. So obviously that was a little bit of a broken down basics. I hope the way that I've structured this, where we talk about how to get the nav mesh to update, and then we slowly add bits and pieces together there, that I've given you a good enough understanding to put all these parts together to create yourself a little world where you can transition into each building. Yeah, now there's one thing that I haven't touched on really, is the simple move to. So in my example, when we run to this part, the character automatically runs into the next zone. That's just basically an advanced model of what we've previously just done. I'll just show you quickly. What you need to do is in your world is just have your where's the floor gone? Select the floor. You just need to have your floor extend just a little bit past your trigger box. And what you'll do is you'll just set up a, if you go to your quick add, go down to all classes and look for, you can actually search in this menu by the way. We want a target point. I think it's called target point. Yeah, it is called target point. So if you get a target point, you can see my search that's failed there. Where's it gone? Did we add it or not? Target point, here we go, target point. Add a target point to the world. Hit the end key just to drop it down into your world. If you don't do that, this won't work. It needs to be sort of either touching the floor or just above it. Have that somewhere, not quite off the edge, but within enough space. Let's have a look. That's pretty good. And keep your trigger point selected for this. This is going to happen in World 1. Now, you need to decide where you're going to do this. So, start the camera fade. As the camera is fading, we want the character to run towards the next zone to give it the appearance as if you're running into it. So, in between your delay and your fade, what you can do is, let's just drag that out. You want to look for a simple move to actor. Now, you can do move to location. You just need to know the sort of vector or coordinates of where you're moving to. Using target points is so much easier, so just use the move to actor, and then you can select your actor. And if you had your target point selected, you can right click, and you can see here you've got the target point sort of selected. Create a reference to it, create reference to target point. You can then drag that into your goal. The controller is just going to get player controller. Let's move that down and make it look a little bit nicer. Plug that in and plug that into that. And then what you'll see is as your transition's happening, it'll appear like your character started running ahead. So let's do player. So as we get to here, as the transition starts. Okay, so that didn't actually work, which that confused me a little bit. What is the reason for that not working? So that is definitely... I'm just going to press end and get that on the floor. I'm just going to double check where my Nav Mesh Bound ends. That might be the reason. Okay, so that's actually the reason. So that's not actually within the Nav Mesh, so that will not help. So let's just make that a tiny little bit bigger. My Nav Mesh, where are we? 3,900. Go for 4,000. So I'm hoping 4,100 will just cover it. Just to be safe, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull that target point in just a little bit so I know that it's within my area. Obviously, your simple move to uses the AI Nav Mesh system. If it's not in the area, it can't run to it. So now let's hit play again, and if I've not forgot anything else, this should work. So we'll click on that, and you can see as the transition's happening, it pulled the character forward. And I think that's just a nice little addition to transitions. Obviously, if you stood at the front of a door to enter a building, that might not work. But either way, I think it's a nice transition to add. So this is becoming quite a long video again. So I do appreciate it if you've watched this far. If you did like it, please consider giving me a like. And if you want to watch more videos like this, consider subscribing. There's also a Discord link down below if you want to join the Discord server. Ask any question you want, or just have a chat. That's up to you. Really appreciate you watching this far, so thank you. Now, as to where I've been for the last couple of weeks. Now, at Christmas, I decided to take a bit of a break, and essentially I just got comfortable. After a 2-week break from work, because I do have a full-time job alongside this YouTube channel, after 2 weeks off work over Christmas, when I returned, life and getting started back at work just got a little bit stressful, and I just didn't think I was ready to come back to YouTube just yet. And as the weeks went by, unfortunately I did just get a little bit complacent with not having to make a video. So I've considered it an extended break. It was much needed, but now I'm finally ready to get back into things. So with that said, I'm looking to pick up older projects. If there are videos in the past that I haven't continued or you want me to build on, please comment down below and let me know which videos you want to watch, and that's that. So I think my son's trying to break into the room now, so that's my time over. Thank you for watching this far, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.